Hi, and welcome to this video tutorial on leading and managing change. And this is part one that I'm calling the big picture because it looks at a couple of key models that encapsulate the overview of change management and its impact on organizations and some high-level ideas about how to lead change effectively. So we're going to look at something called the classic change curve, which is a good sense of how change impacts people throughout its cycle in virtually every situation. We're going to look at Lewin's fundamental model, which came out a long time ago and was the basis for many other models that followed it. We're going to look at John Kotter's model, which is used often in the change world today. And we're going to have a look also at the McKinsey model of key elements that need to be included in any change management effort to make sure it works. It's called the Change Management Checklist. So we'll be discussing these things here in part one. Let's begin. So in the first part, we're going to start with something called the classic change curve. And this is a model that's used to understand what happens if we don't lead and manage change effectively. What are the benefits if we do lead it well? And what are the opportunities for everyone to be involved who would be impacted by the change in order to be more successful in the long run? If we start a change, and you may have experienced this in your own life, without necessarily a lot of foresight, but a lot of enthusiasm, we have a lot of energy and a lot of expectation at the beginning. So that's the upside of this, is how we start off strong. The challenge is that without an awareness of what we really need to make the change effective, in other words, to really implement it properly and lead it through all of the bumps and curves that will inevitably come up, we're going to hit an area that in the change curve we call the despair zone. And this is because the real work begins not too long after we start. And all of a sudden we start to see obstacles come up that maybe we weren't anticipating, people who were not necessarily supporting us when we thought they were, and other challenges along the way. And this can really suck the energy out of a change effort. So we have to be careful that we don't avoid looking at and planning carefully so that we can actually ensure that we have the elements in place to make it successful. Out of the despair stage, if we're not planning effectively in advance, we start to see that the outcome inevitably is probably not what we were hoping for. The results inevitably don't reach the potential that they could have because those elements weren't in place. When we do plan for a change and we do it effectively, what this curve is showing, and it's symbolic, but what it is showing is that instead of starting quickly and with a lot of energy, we start with still a lot of energy, but with an awareness that there are things we need to be diligent about. There's a term that's often used in the world of organization change, and it's going slow to go fast. And what this really means is that we are taking the time up front to map out the key steps, resources we need, people involvement, and all these other things that we're going to talk about in a moment to ensure that we pay attention to what we ultimately want to see at the end, and that is the most important. So we start slower, not necessarily dead slow, and our enthusiasm might not be quite the same peak as it might have been, but it's still got energy, but it's got a lot more pacing to it. So we see here that this part of the curve is a little bit flatter, but the despair part, where the work really digs in, where we start to feel the impact of the work we're doing and dealing with challenges along the way, it dips less because we've already thought ahead. Now, there's always going to be things that we miss that come up along the way, and we have to be agile about it, but we will be able to be proactive, knowing that there's going to be a bit of a grind at some point during the process of leading our change, with the hope and the opportunity to get a better result than we might have even thought of initially. So that's what this change curve is showing you. With some good planning, we'll have fewer bumps along the road and the opportunity for much greater success in the end. Now let's take a look at Kurt Lewin's model. So this is going back to the 1950s, but it's a model that's referenced often, and we see now that it was a foundational model that provided us a bit of a roadmap to leading change in organizations. Kurt Lewin created a model that articulated three main stages of leading change if we wanted to see change stick in an organization and have a long-term effect. The first thing he identified we needed to do was to unfreeze the organization. And what this simply means is we need to unfreeze or unlock that part of the organization that we want to make changes to. So we are disrupting the norms of behavior, potentially the systems, aspects of the culture, whatever it is we're working on changing. It will be in a bit of a fixed pattern or a fixed framework that in order to create a change, we have to shake it up or open it up. And really what we're doing is changing the status quo or preparing the status quo to be able to be receptive to the change. And at this stage, this is when we start to look at things like resistance, encouraging people to participate, this kind of stuff that says a change is coming. We do this through communication, through research, this kind of thing. And that is step one. Following this, Lewin posited that we have to now create movement. And this is when the change is implemented. So we are putting in a new system, new behaviors, new whatever it is. And this solution to whatever the problem was to begin with is where, as we said, we create movement in the organization to do something in a new way. One would hope a better way. So that's the change phase. And then finally, he said, once we create that movement and implement a change, we need to refreeze the organization, essentially lock it down. And in essence, what we're doing is creating a new status quo. So we're consolidating the changes that we've implemented. We're integrating them into the system. And we're essentially creating a platform for potential new changes down the road. Why this is a bit outdated is we realize that this idea of refreezing is a bit of a problem in today's day and age, because the work it takes to unlock the status quo is a matter of time and resources that organizations today really prefer not to expend, because it takes time that prevents them from being responsive to whatever is going on around them. So what we want to do is use some good ideas from this model, but we want to evolve it. We want to make sure that we don't lock up the organization, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we do embed the changes. So one of the challenges about leading change is once we create the change is not only to maintain that change, but also look then to sustaining it in a way that actually flows more fluidly into a more evolutionary kind of status quo. So in other words, the status quo is not everything being flat, but rather creating an environment where changes happen more organically and we can be more proactive and spend less energy on unlocking an organization that's sort of become very fixed. The next model we're going to look at is John Kotter's 8-step model. And this one has become well established and often either used directly or has spawned other models of people have based their work on and expanded upon his work. And since it was originally conceived, it actually has been modified a little bit by John Kotter to add some modifiers that give it a little bit more clarity. So let's have a look now at John Kotter's 8-step model. The first thing we have to do is establish the need for urgency. In other words, this is something that people need to understand why it's important, why we need the change now, and ensure that people understand that this is something that is valuable for people to engage with. Definitely need to establish the need for urgency. We need to ensure that there is a powerful change group to guide the change, sometimes referred to a change coalition. This is something that we need to be sure we have in place early on. These are people that are going to be not only stakeholders, but also people that are hopefully going to be directly involved that will support the change in different parts of the organization that are affected by the change so that you have that support along the way. We need to make sure we have a great vision, a good, clear vision for that change. And the reality is these folks in step 2 are going to want to know what that vision is. And eventually they will be contributing to that vision and refining it and ensuring that it really meets the needs of the organization. We have to communicate that vision to all the people that are impacted by the change. We have to make sure that we empower the staff. In other words, the people that are not only involved early on, but the people that are impacted the change, we need to share the responsibility of that change and invite their contributions and creativity to ensure its success. We also need to give them some of the authority to implement that change so that it's not all top down. We need to ensure that there are short-term wins. We need a victory from time to time. We need to recognize that most change efforts have many different steps along the way, and once you accomplish something, you need to celebrate it and share that accomplishment with everyone that's involved. And that way people will see progress and you'll be able to maintain momentum. We need to consolidate gains. This is about ensuring that we're embedding these things within the organization. So once you're making progress, you want to make sure that you recognize that progress, follow through to make sure that the progress is sticking so that you don't backslide and then lose ground, and ensure that you keep creating bedrock for the next part of the change that has to take place. And the last one is embedding the change in the culture. Now, what does this really mean? This means that whatever change is in place, that it becomes part of the norms of behavior. It becomes part of the normative way we work, and that we see it as a way of life that we have within this organization and not something that is continually resisted down the road, which raises all kinds of other problems if that's the case. So embedding it in the culture means that people are not only buying into it, but they're implementing it as if it were just the normal way of working on a daily basis. Now, a few years after creating this model, John Kotter acknowledged that there were some things missing. The first one, and I thought that was possibly the most important one, is that these are not steps, but rather they are accelerators that must work concurrently. In other words, this is not linear. This is something that they won't all work at exactly the same time, but many of them work in parallel. So as you're going through a change effort, you're going to see that often you'll have to include various elements in whatever meetings you're having, or tasks will be consolidated. Sometimes they'll overlap. So you may find yourself repeatedly communicating the vision while you're empowering staff and while you're celebrating short-term wins, or maybe you're reminding people of how urgent something is or how important it is while you're communicating the vision and while you're celebrating the short-term wins and then consolidating your gains. And the embedding the change in the culture is not something that happens at the end. That's something that's ongoing. So a lot of these steps happen in parallel and will be mixed up together. However, when you're mapping it out, you can create timelines that actually show where a lot of these things overlap. So it's not like every single thing will happen absolutely concurrently, but the overlapping is very important to understand. We must also see that change cannot rely only on a small, powerful core group. In other words, in step 2, we talk about having a powerful change group. You need much more than that. So if you look at step 2 and step 5, these are really what we're talking about here. We need to make sure that we cultivate many change agents across the organization and ensure that the responsibility and authority is spread out. And that ensures that we can embed things a lot more easily and that we can actually share in the responsibility and successes along the way, thus ensuring it becomes more embedded in the culture and so on. And finally, the third revision, he comments that traditional hierarchy must be complemented by flexible agile networks. And what this means is, for many, in fact, most of the change efforts, it doesn't mean we have to tear down whatever the hierarchy is. What it means is we have to be allowed to create informal, agile, flexible networks of people who are implementing the change, which often will kind of butt up against the traditional hierarchy, but the hierarchy has to be able to permit it. Otherwise, you're dead in the water. So if you're working in a very conservative organization or a very rigid organization in terms of structure, one of the challenges is the time it can take to invite people into the process and see the benefit of whatever change you're working on. And as you're working through those silos or borders and boundaries, if there's no permission and there's no support, then you're going to find yourself not being able to implement it. So that's John Kotter's 8-step model, plus the 3 revisions, of course, from a high level. Let's now look at the main reasons why change efforts fail. And we're going to do this quite briefly because you're going to see a direct parallel with John Kotter's model. Not surprisingly, it's coming out of that model that we see these errors and these issues that come up if we don't do our change planning and implementation in a really good methodical way. One of the first mistakes we can make is not to have a sense of urgency. And I would say it's not that we don't have the urgency if we're leading the change effort, it's that people don't see it. So that's a communication issue as well as our own awareness, but this is something that's really, really important. People are busy. Doesn't matter what they're doing within an organization, they have their priorities. And your job is to try to convince them to make what your effort is, your initiative is, a priority in their eyes. So it's being clear for yourself first, really clear, and you have to be sincere because people can smell a rat. They know when it's not clear or when it sounds manipulative. And you need to be able to spell out those benefits for the organization and specifically for the people involved. But the urgency is the key. Is now the time to do it? No coalition, so you don't have that backup. So if you're working on a substantial change, having a couple of people involved is great. It's a good start, but it's not enough. Your vision is not there or it's not clear. Again, this goes back to the urgency because this is going to be part of that communication. You need to be able to say, here's the potential for this, here's what the potential outcome and benefit is for the organization, and here's why it's important now. Communication, that's all tied up in the first three as well, because you need to communicate and develop a strong coalition to support your effort. And again, in the model, we see why this is so valuable. Another challenge to a change effort is that the obstacles in the way are not addressed or removed. Now, that's not an easy process. It depends what the change is and what the obstacle might be. Is it an organizational structure challenge? Is it a job design challenge? Is it a reward system or appraisal system difficulty? Is there a key individual getting in the way? So all of these things need to be addressed as they pertain to the change effort you're leading. So you're not going to just wave a magic wand and something's going to disappear. But as you plan out your change effort, and even as you move through it in the early stages, if you've missed something, it's going to become apparent and will slow you down. That's just part of it. You're going to have blind spots, and so will everyone who's involved. So it's really important that those things be addressed in some way. Otherwise, they'll come back and start to erode the change that you're trying to implement. There are no wins along the way. We need to understand that change simply takes time. And the bigger the change and the bigger the organization, the longer it's simply going to take. We wish it were faster, and in some cases it might be a little bit faster than we anticipated. But if we really look at our whole system that we're working in, we'll see that the time it takes can also be both a benefit as we see the landscape clearer, but it can take away momentum. So as you get that victory, as you make an accomplishment, as you achieve a goal, you have to celebrate it and recognize it so that we can see the progress we're making and keep the momentum up. The next error that's often made is that we declare victory prematurely. We haven't completed really the change implementation to the point where it really is solid. And so we say, yes, we've achieved it. We've done all these great things. What happens when this occurs is we will backslide. In other words, we haven't started to embed the changes fully. And people will say, oh, it's great, it's all over, we're done. But that gap will lead potentially to old ways of doing things, old norms, eroding that achievement. And you may find that this wonderful change, whatever it is, starts to lose impact and it starts to fade. So we have to be careful not to declare premature victory, but to make sure we consolidate our gains. In other words, really embed those changes along the way, those achievements along the way, and support them and make sure you're really, really thorough. And then the last one is no anchoring. And this is about the final kind of embedding in the culture. That means it needs support, it needs reinforcement. Depending on what the change is, it might be easier for some things and not as easy as others. If it's a change in cultural elements, perhaps norms of behavior or values or things like that, those are very easy to be manipulated back or to be forgotten or ignored or that kind of thing. So whatever it is we're doing, you have to make sure we continuously anchor the changes so that when we are finished, it really does become a part of the living organization overall. Now that we've looked at John Kotter's model in detail and looked at some of the mistakes that occur along the way and how to avoid them, we're going to take a look now at a checklist that was created by McKinsey, the big consulting company, to let us see more clearly, no matter where we are in the change, what we need to make sure we have in place so that our change can be successful. This is not a step-by-step process. These are the things that we have to keep in mind and in our plans to ensure that we actually reach the goal of the change and the potential that that change offers us. Now, you're going to see in this that some of these things overlap in what we've heard before, and it's good to have different perspectives on the same things, but these are elements that we need to include both in our plans and in our actions. So the first one, of course, is goals. So we have to go for growth and progressive developmental change and make sure we're stretching our targets. By stretching even further than we might thought of initially, that means we have a better chance of getting some of that change in versus having goals that are very conservative and may not have much of an impact on the organization. So good stretch targets, clear goals, and then celebrating those outcomes along the way will help us a lot. The next part of the checklist has to do with structures. So we're looking at things like logical program design. We want to make sure our processes, as much as we can in our change effort, are broken down into clearly defined initiatives so that people can track and understand what we're trying to achieve. Now, you're not going to be able to break down every single element. It's really helpful to have people involved in doing that as well, by the way. That encourages engagement. It also helps us find errors and gaps in our planning. But the other thing is to make sure that people see things that are achievable in the short to medium term and not just the long term. We need to ensure that all those involved are able to help create the program. And this is a really important idea of engagement. We can also call it perhaps co-creation. This is a powerful idea and very important for significant change in an organization, that people co-own and are not just sold on the idea. You want to make sure you have clear roles and responsibilities and accountabilities. So this goes beyond the group that we have supporting it initially, that these are coming from other people that are involved in the change, and that they're accountable for their actions, that they have responsibilities. And you'll find that people really warm up to it and shine when they're given that opportunity. The next section is involvement. So this is an extension of what we've heard a little bit about so far, but we want to make sure that we have high levels of engagement and collaboration. And this comes with some of the other steps, like allowing people to be involved in co-creating the program. That's part of how we create engagement and collaboration. You want to make sure you have frontline ownership, and that means that all those who are involved in experiencing the change help to drive it as well. So you want to get past the leadership, at least the formal leadership in the organization, and get frontline folks, the folks that really are going to be living with the change, at least somewhat involved in designing and implementing the change, if at all possible. The other thing is they're going to give you great information that you might not get from your management colleagues. And the last one here is that we have high levels of communication and involvement at all stages. So again, we're repeating this idea of involvement. And we talk about communication. Yes, we have to communicate all kinds of things as we go along, but we need to be able to listen as well. And so listen to what people are telling us, listen to ideas or things that we might be missing, or cautions or unexpected resources that sometimes land in our lap that are amazing. So high levels of communication, I'm going to say this is not just two-way, but multi-way communication. Really, really important. And the last section is about leadership. Is the personal commitment and visible involvement of the chief executive there? In other words, if this involves the whole organization, is the top involved? In other words, have they given it their blessing? Even if they're not directly involved, if it's something that cuts across the organization and the chief executive needs to make sure they give it their blessing, make sure they do that. Because people will ask, well, how come the CEO hasn't said anything? Or how come the division head hasn't said anything? It's going to raise eyebrows and questions and will take away from the credibility of what you're doing. Leaders need to role model whatever the desired change is. And when we talk about leaders, it could be people just in the department itself. And again, depending on how broadly impacting the change is, the leaders that are connected to that in one way or another need to role model it for sure. They're not expected to be perfect. That's not what we're talking about, but that they are trying. We need to develop the capacity and capability for continuous improvement. So this is something that can be a really helpful byproduct as you move through changes within an organization, whether they have a long history of doing changes well or not. Once you do a project successfully, that raises the expectation that we can do more things like this. And so you start to develop a bit of a culture and a mindset and a capacity and capability for continuous improvement. And continuous improvement is the antidote to Kurt Lewin's refreezing of the organization. So we want to be moving toward a place where changes become easier to launch and implement because we're much more open to them and we're much more agile. And then the last one is that the culture becomes more receptive to further innovation. So once we develop the capacity and capability to do it, that the culture, the values and belief systems within the organization, the norms of behavior are receptive to further innovation. Not just that we can do it, but that we want to do it because we see the upside in all of it. So that's about it for part one. We've looked at the classic change curve. We've taken a look at Kurt Lewin's 3-stage model of change and both its benefits and challenges. We've explored John Kotter's 8-stage model with the 3 accelerators. And we've looked at some of the errors that show up when we're leading change, which can lead to a less than successful change effort. And then, of course, the last thing we've just discussed is the McKinsey Checklist to ensure that our change initiatives are as successful as possible. In the change management video tutorial part 2, we're going to take a look at ways we can explore and understand what is going on in our organization in terms of its readiness for the change initiative we want to lead and implement, as well as understanding some of the forces that are working in support of it and what some of the forces that might be working against it, and also understand who the stakeholders are, who has both a role to play as well as who is impacted by the change we are planning, so that we have a better understanding of what we need to do in our plan, who we need to get involved, who has resources we need, and in that way we'll be much clearer and avoid some of the pitfalls we've already discussed.